Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in just a minute here. If you're just coming in, you should see a little poll launch. We'll do one at the end as well. I see 6:01 p.m. Mountain Time, so we'll go ahead and get going. My name is Tal Kitron with Appleroot Tutoring Services. Been with the company for about 11, 12 years now in various capacities. But today I'm here to talk to you guys about the enhanced ACT, aka the new version of the ACT. We're scheduled for an hour. Probably won't take that entire time, but maybe close to it. And I'll make sure to leave some time at the end for questions and answers. So if you do have any, put them in the Q&A. I'll get to those at the end. Generally, Appleroot does send out these recordings on, I think, Friday. So end of the week, you should get it. I'm sure I'll still get that question, so I may repeat that. But yeah, without further ado, let's get started. And as people trickle in, we're just going to kind of introduce, and we'll get into the nitty gritty of ACT. Here's what we're planning to cover today. Format of the brand new EACT. What has changed from prior ACTs and what is staying the same. We'll also compare it a little bit to SAT. We'll talk about content, so what materials being tested, as well as important strategies on each of the 4 sections. And then a little bit about testing timelines as well, when to prep, when to register. There's not any right answer for that, but I can give some guidance. And if people have questions at the end, we can, of course, get to that as well. Notice where we're at in this timeline of the enhanced ACT rollout. And we'll talk all about what that is. In April 2025, so April of this year, the in-school tests, the national ones, changed to this new version. Starting in September, so next month, and the next ACT that's offered, it's switching to the new version, which is both computer, digital, and also paper test. If you have an option to take either, I'd recommend the paper one for now, and we can talk a bit more about that as well. But the ACT isn't, it's a fairly big change. They're testing the same stuff, but anyone who's taking an ACT from here on out should expect what we're going to talk about today. And then the only way that you'd be taking like an old ACT and non-enhanced, so the way it was in July and in June and before, is if you take an in-school testing date, some of the state and district testing through the end of this year, in spring 2026, will actually be the old ACT. Very few of you will have to worry about that. There aren't that many in-school ACTs offered, like on a weekday usually. So for anyone registering for September, October, December, February, April, the official ACTs on Saturdays, you'll be looking at the new EACT that we're discussing. The biggest change is not the content, but the timing and the amount of questions. The prior ACT, the one that people took in July, for example, was a little over 3 hours. This new version is closer to 2. Look also at the time per question. Right, so in English, the current ACT, or sorry, I shouldn't put current, that's the current as of July. So the old ACT, 36, enhanced ACT, you get 42 seconds per question. That's a huge difference. And then on reading and science, it's even bigger. So although the ACT is still a test of speed, you definitely want to practice pacing and timing. It's less so than it was. It became a lot more SAT-like in its structure and its timing. But throughout on all sections, more time per question, which is undoubtedly a good thing. So let's talk scoring. The ACT has always been out of 36. That is not changing, despite one big change that we'll talk about. As of September, the science section, which is why I have stars around it at the bottom there, is optional. You can opt in or you can opt out. I would probably recommend that if you aren't certain about whether you're going to go into STEM or just don't know yet, but you're taking the EACT, at least for now, I'd probably recommend taking the science section. But timing wise, here's what you're looking at. English, which is always section 1, 50 questions, 35 minutes. So that's about 45 seconds per question, which seems fast, but some of it's very simple grammar. So it'll take 10 seconds for some questions and a couple minutes for others. Then math, much shorter than it used to be, 45 questions as opposed to 60 and 50 minutes instead of an hour. So over a minute on average per question. Not all questions created equal. And then reading, 36 questions down from 40, and that's 40 minutes. So again, 1 minute, 6 seconds per question, approximately. And then science, which actually used to be more like 50 seconds per question, is now 40 questions in 40 minutes instead of 35 minutes. About a minute per question, but you'll probably be wanting to skip around and attack certain passages and questions and grab the easy points, which is a theme throughout the ACT. Because the science section is now becoming optional, the composite score, so the overall ACT score, is now just the average of English, math, and reading. So you add them up and divide by 3. Science is going to produce a totally separate score, so a standalone out of 36. It will not be included in the composite score. That's obviously a pretty big shift. If you are thinking about going into STEM, that's definitely what you want to do. And it's really like it's kind of a tough decision on whether or not to opt out of science or to opt in, which is why I say if in doubt, just take it, right? Worst case, you're not going to submit it, right? Or it just, it's not included in your composite. So the downside isn't that bad. And it's like a $4 fee to opt in. So if you are on the fence about it, take it. If you know, like, hey, I'm not applying to anywhere where STEM is important, but I like the ACT better than SAT, then opt out, right? Don't take the science. It's a shorter test, less to worry about. The format, so we always go in this order. English first, 6 passages. Math, used to be 5 answer choices per question. Now it's 4, which is great. All multiple choice. Then a break in the middle, followed by reading, which is 4 passages total, and then the optional science, which is still kind of a breakneck speed section, 7 passages, 40 minutes, 40 questions. But again, it used to be over 3 hours of testing. So like if you had extended time, because let's say we had ADHD, and so I get time and a half, then you're there for like, it used to be, we'd be there for almost 5 hours. And that's a blessing and a curse. If you have ADHD, for example, focus is kind of at issue. We have a lack of focus problem. And so being there for 5 hours isn't necessarily a help. Of course, yes, we need that extra time, but it's much nicer to say, okay, now you get time and a half, and that's just 3.5 hours. We're not spending the entire day there or even the entire morning. And it'll always go in this order. There's still an optional essay portion, which I didn't really put much in this presentation because almost nobody takes the essay, and very, very, very few colleges even consider it. So what about the content? And we'll get into each individual section. The ACT test grammar, that is one of the first things we always go over. Like if I tutor a student, we're always going to start with a practice test and reviewing it, and then get into grammar rules, punctuation, clauses, semicolons, periods, all that. Because people have often learned it, but maybe not properly, or it's been forever. There's a lot of high school math, anything from arithmetic to algebra to geometry and trig and even pre-calc. ACT math is really know a lot about a little. They just want to know, hey, have you seen this before? And if so, they'll give you a point. Reading comprehension, really on every section, and also vocab and context on the reading section in particular. And then graph reading and interpreting data, that's on math, but it's mainly via that optional science section. That's going to be a lot more just graph reading, matching, some scientific thought, but a whole lot of graphs. And this is honestly quite similar to what the SAT tests. The biggest difference I would say is more graphs on ACT because of science. And then SAT doesn't really get into pre-calc too much. It's more algebra 2, and it's more algebra heavy than the ACT. The ACT doesn't provide geometry formulas, but does test it kind of a lot. as well as just kind of wordy problems and other things that don't really come up that often in actual math class. The SAT is a bit more Common Core algebra heavy. So before we get into the individual sections and question types and strategies, the general rule and general strategy is make sure you're practicing pacing, like always taking a practice test to start, see what your baseline is. But then as you practice, whether that's individually or with a tutor, we want to do consistent mock tests to measure progress and learn from mistakes. And a lot of times what those mistakes are is people not answering what the question is really asking, flipping a negative sign, solving for X instead of Y. So keep in mind, the second rule is keep it simple. There's almost always an easy method of solving. So if you find yourself doing derivatives and regressions and all these things, it's probably too much. You probably should be using the answers or picking numbers to plug in or something simple. And then there is no guessing penalty, no points off for wrong answers, which means don't leave anything blank. But do strategically skip around. If you're taking 2 minutes on a question and you're not close, right, or you just feel like, man, I'm taking too long, move past it. Go get easier points, which aren't the same for everyone. Maybe you're a geometry whiz, so you'll go do those, whereas other people might shy away from that and just try to get the algebra questions. But leave nothing blank, which means if you do run out of time, which still happens, I would guess straight down the line. Let's say we got 5 questions we didn't get to. I would go D, 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 D. Am I going to get them all? Probably not. But I'm not going to miss them all, most likely. So just statistically, you're better off bubbling straight down when you guess and run out of time than Christmas treeing it. Because if you do that, A, B, C, D, CBA, B, C, D, very likely you'll miss them all. So if you go straight down the line, you're probably going to get at least 1 or 2 of those correct. And that is a strategy. I mean, that can make a big difference. Could be a couple points on the final score. So we're going to start with English because that's what the ACT starts with. And that is broadly broken down into 2 categories, grammar and rhetoric. Grammar is all about rules, but also trusting your ear. So does it sound right? And rhetoric is more, all right, does it stay on topic? Does it flow well? The format is 6 passages. 3 or 4 of those will be medium passages of 10 questions. And then depending on how many of those there are, there'll be either 2 or 3 short passages with 5 questions. The passages don't matter that much. They're really just like they're on the left-hand side and you've got the grammar questions for the most part. And so you don't really need to read. You just kind of go back and forth and get context when you need it, which would be more for the rhetoric questions. This is kind of an interesting thing because I still firmly believe in using the answer choices, but the way the new ACT English is, they won't just give you, hey, here are 4 answers, guess what type of grammar question it is. They actually now title the questions. So they'll say like which choice, not just which choice best conforms to the conventions of standard English, but they'll say which punctuation mark is correct, or which verb is most proper. So you don't have to do that much like intuitively seeing, hey, these answer choices are testing verbs, so that's what it is. They'll tell you now. So even grammar questions have questions, whereas it used to be like this, just no change. The reason I left this slide in is because here I'd like people to be able to see, especially with training, once you become an ACT expert, looking at A, glide versus C, glides, and seeing, wait a second, those are both present tense verbs. I don't think this is verb tense. This got to be subject verb agreement. And from there, there's all sorts of little like clues that they're kind of laying, which is one of those is going to be correct. Usually the subject's way before the verb to confuse us, but in this case, it's actually after, subject's after the verb, which is strange. And so even though it feels weird to say mountaintops glides, that is the answer because it's over the mountaintops glides the eagle glides. Another clue there, again, once you get to be a real expert, is you see A and D are both plural verbs. They glide, they were gliding. That's kind of a clue that the one that stands out, C, is the answer. And then ing verbs just cause fragments a lot. They're often wrong on both this test and SAT. What I mean by that is, if I ask a student, what tense is gliding? Well, they'll usually say, oh, I think that's present tense. And you could be right. If I said he is gliding, but if I said he was gliding, it's past, he will be gliding is future. So when I say ing verbs are bad, it's because if I said tall gliding, that's just bad English, right? There's no helper verb, so it's a fragment maker. So a lot of things you can get just from the answers, even though they are not going to provide like what they're actually testing, even on grammar. So that's, I think, a nice change. Here are a few examples, all of these testing punctuation. So what you should note is you start on the right side of the page. It's kind of counterintuitive. On the reading section, yeah, we're going to read. We'll talk about that. But on English, you start on the right side of the page and determine, okay, what based on these answers or the question they've asked, what are they testing? Right? Pretty clearly punctuation changing in number one from choice to choice. So I'd recommend testing semicolons and periods first because they are identical on this test. Semicolons and periods both separate two full sentences. So you need independent clause before and after. That's why for number one, A is wrong. Circular patterns made of sand is not a full sentence. So the next easiest rule to test would be the colon, choice D. And a colon must come after a full sentence, and it must be used as a drum roll. The two dots are like two drumsticks. Drum roll, please, introducing something. This is our answer because in 1995, divers off the coast of Japan discovered a surprise on the seafloor. Drum roll, please, what was it? Circular patterns made of sand. Number two in comparison is testing comma placement and only comma placement, as well as some verb issues. So like C and D, if you look closely, these circles were over 7 feet and containing, no. These circles were over 7 feet and contains, also no. So it's really just a matter of A versus B on number two. Do we want the comma or not? If we could get away without it, I'd say pick B, but we can't here because that making them appear much like a target or leaning pad is a brand new dependent clause, different idea. Now, three is where the rules come into play because B and D are identical and therefore both wrong. I'll say that again. Semicolons and periods on this test are identical. Can't have two right answers. So if nothing else has changed around them, and there's B semicolon D period, both wrong, no doubt. If it's a dash, to pick a dash, you generally need another one in the passage. And here the other dashes are not M dashes. It's just like short-lived and then periodically because it's a split of the page. So I don't think a dash would work here. We would just want to separate with a comma. And usually if we've ruled out a period or semicolon, the comma answer is often correct. Other grammar topics you can expect, and we've seen now subject verb, and we saw clauses and punctuation, but you'll also see verb tense, pronouns, so who versus whom, I versus me, which people are confident with but shouldn't be. Everyone does I versus me wrong. Possession, so that would be its versus its. IT apostrophe S, probably never right on this test, but also singular versus plural possession rules. A lot of people are rusty with that. Modifiers, that's word order. Connectors, so however, nevertheless, therefore, consequently, and so on. And then the two biggest things even still are redundancy and brevity, keeping things short and sweet and non-repetitive. When in doubt on ACT English, cut it out. Pick the shortest answer. That is definitely a grammar rule. It is not, however, a rhetoric rule, which are the longer questions on English. And sometimes intimidating, but can really be some of the easiest. An add delete would be a classic example. So like here, we don't have enough context to say yes or no, but the question would look like, at this point, the writer's considering adding or deleting the following statement. And then we look in the passage and think at that spot, all right, would that stay on topic? So would it make it better? And would it flow smoothly? And if it's a no, it's going to be a fairly obvious, oh no, this is horrible. It's better without. Ideally, the strategy is pick the yes or no first. Like, yeah, I think it's good, or no, I hate it. And then it's usually pretty easy to pick between the two remaining answers. And for grammar, again, short answers are important. Here, it doesn't matter at all. So as soon as it's a rhetoric question and they're asking about like the actual flow of the passage, we don't care about punctuation or short and sweet. That's only for grammar stuff. So here's an example. And a lot of times our job is just to accomplish some sort of task, which is exactly what it sounds like. We would start with the question, which is at the underlying point, the writer wants to provide specific information about her brother's hobbies. And then there's more boilerplate language. Given that all the choices are true, which one best accomplishes this purpose? So our job is just an answer that provides specific information about hobbies. So we go straight down the list. No change is not very specific. Things I find very boring are games I like, not specific. B, very specific, perfect answer. Legos, Lincoln Log masterpieces, those are specific hobbies. C, not specific enough. D, not as specific as B. So specific information was the key phrase in the question, and it makes it pretty easy and clear that we're going to pick B on that one. The skills you can expect to be tested, order placement, probably the hardest. So asking like, where should this sentence be placed, or paragraph, or word? Writer's goal, which would come at the end of the passage, and it would be the writer intended to accomplish this goal. Did they? Yes, yes, no, no, and why? Those are tough because we haven't really read, so you got to go back and skim. Adding, deleting, which we saw, and then accomplishing a task. You want to be a robot on a lot of this test, but especially for rhetoric, eliminate answers, again, that don't stay on topic or don't flow smoothly. And try to be objective, right? This is not just you taking this test, it's a bunch of other people too. What were the writers trying to get us to see about these answers? So wrong answers first is really a good rule of thumb on English and reading, right? Find the bad answers the test writers put in intentionally to be wrong, and that will get you to the best answer. Not provable like it is in math, but we can get pretty close. So that's English. The final tips and tricks I have, make sure you differentiate between grammar and rhetoric, which is pretty simple to see. For grammar, we trust our ear. We like short answers. For rhetoric, we don't care about any of that. We just want to transition and stay on topic. And especially now that there are fewer questions, the curve will be a bit harsher. So treasure every question on ACT English, especially as if it's worth 1 point, because it probably is. Sometimes maybe even more. And always pay attention to what the question is asking, right? Sometimes we even need to go back and reread a question, not even rethink, but just make sure, did I miss a word somewhere? Cool. Doing great on time. That's English. And so if you have questions about it, you put it in the Q&A, we'll get there later. Let's talk math, section 2. Calculators allowed throughout. There's no calculator section on the ACT. And on the right, you can see how it used to be 5 answer choices per question. Now it's only 4. So you'll just see A, B, C, D, right? No E's or K's. They do not provide formulas, but they do tend to test geometry a lot. So you need to know stuff like area of a triangle and Pythagoras, and even maybe special right triangles like 30, 60, 90. And circle, area, circumference, what's the difference? That's a big kind of spot where people are lacking, especially when they start tutoring, in my experience. But again, the ACT math is a grab bag. Even on this, you see a logic question, number 40, you see geometry, 41, and then arithmetic, inequalities, 42. So got to be thinking, what's a simple solution? If you get stuck, we want to probably use the answers or pick our own numbers. And again, 50 minutes for 45 questions, still fast paced, but not as bad as it used to be. They do get harder as they go. So not all questions are created equal. You have to kind of embrace that you may skip a few questions and guess and try to grab all the easy points. That's a good rule generally for test taking. Tough spot on standardized tests to be a perfectionist. Like I have some perfectionist tendencies, and that was not helpful on ACT, SAT, because you got to know when to just cut bait sometime and move on, right? Sometimes it's just like, man, this question's taking me too long. It's better that you miss it in a minute than it is to get it correct in 3 minutes, which is very hard to come to grips with. But if we take 3 minutes, we're sacrificing several other questions probably. So strategy for math, rule number 1, circle what you're solving for. So I'm assuming we're taking a paper test still. So pencil in hand, always moving. translate words into math, and vice versa sometimes. A lot of wordy problems, maybe fewer than there used to be, but still quite a few word problems. Show your work. I'm sure every math teacher ever has said that. Use your calculator. You can bring just about any calculator. So like not like SAT where they have a built-in Desmos, which is kind of absurd and a real cheat code. But you can bring a TI-80, whatever, even most TI Inspires are legal. As long as it doesn't make noise or connect to the internet, your calculator is probably legal for ACT. And then check your answer. I mean, within reason, because it is a time test, we have to rush at points, but do double check, make a logic check of, does this angle measure seem right? Is it less than 90 or more than 90? Just a quick double check that you solve for the right thing. So we're gonna look at some problems. This is just showing like one thing they could test, which is trig. I mentioned you got to remember special right triangles and some geometry rules, but also SOHCAHTOA. So people haven't thought about sine, cosine, tangent in this way, at least in a long time. Maybe we're thinking about it at a higher level, which is good and bad, right? So you really only need algebra 2 to do these tests. But if you're into calculus, there are going to be certain occasions where you're working harder than you need to, or thinking unit circle when it's just radians to degrees. But this would be kind of a classic easy example of just, you remember SOHCAHTOA? If so, here's a point. Right from the middle of the section, tangent of small a there would just be opposite over adjacent, which is big A over big B. Right, so for that one, it definitely would just be choice A as your answer. And SOHCAHTOA is something that doesn't always stick for people. It's not the most friendly mnemonic device, but it is one of those things that's worth reviewing before testing. So here's a trig example. If a ladder leans against the wall, as shown in the figure below, if the ladder is 26 feet long and the base of the ladder is 24 feet from the wall, how many feet up the wall does the ladder reach? Some of you may have noticed that we didn't really need to read that except for what we're solving for, which is the wall, the height. They've labeled everything, right? So I've got a hypotenuse and a base, and we just need the other side of a right triangle. If it's not a special right triangle, which it may or may not be, use the Pythagorean theorem. This is something they don't provide, but most people know. A squared plus B squared equals C squared, where C is always the longest side. We know C is 26. 24 can be either A or B, doesn't matter. So we'll make it A, and we have 24 squared plus B squared equals 26 squared, and then we just calculate. That gets you B squared is 100, so B is 10. That's our answer. I started the special right triangle because you may notice, hey, this is actually a multiple of 5, 12, 13. Honestly, probably not worth trying to memorize that or hold it in your brain because you could just do Pythagoras. So the fewer things we have to memorize, probably the better. Probability. A bag of mixed nuts contains 9 macadamias, 13 cashews, 18 peanuts. How many additional cashews must be added to make the probability of randomly drawing a cashew 2/5? This is a harder question. And I don't think it's very intuitive as far as the best way to solve. Using the answers would work. But what I'd recommend is if you are asked something like this about a changing probability, so that means the denominator that we're picking from, the amount of nuts total plus the amount of cashews are both changing. So it's easier for us to focus on what isn't changing. Instead of figuring out how to make cashews 2/5, let's figure out how to make the other two types of nuts 3/5 of the total. Right? Because if it's 2/5 at the end of cashews, 3/5 is what's remaining. And those aren't changing. It's going to be 27, 9 macadamias, 18 peanuts the whole time. So the setup there would be 27 out of X, what final total would be 3 out of 5. And again, not intuitive to look at the other things besides the cashews, but that's our move. 27 over X is 3/5. Fraction equals fraction, we cross multiply. We get 135 is 3X, or X is 45, so we need 45 total mixed nuts. Finally then, That might be an answer choice, but it wouldn't be right. The question is, how many more cashews do we need to add to make 45 total? And if we know that we've got a total of 40, I believe, and we can subtract that from 45, we'll end up with 5. They do it a tiny bit differently. But either way, we land on B, 5 as our answer. This is probably the hardest question we've seen, just because it's very much not innate to look at the other side of the probability. You'd have to practice that and see it a few times. But yeah, our answer here is B. Last math tips and tricks for now. Again, show your work. Use your calculator, even for basic math. Like I was having a student today who was doing like 36 minus 19 and kept getting 27. But it's not, it's 17. And it's one of those where on test day, it's very easy to make that mistake. And the answer choices will probably try to trap you into it. Prioritize easier questions. Don't worry about not getting to everything, but don't leave anything blank. For sure, before test day, review your basic geometry and trig rules like SOHCAHTOA and area stuff and circumference, as well as mean, median, mode. A lot of people get those mixed up. Median, think median of the highway, it's the middle number. Mode is the most common. And then mean is average. That's probably what they test most often. If it's geometry and they didn't give you a shape, draw it. That's huge. And then if you get stuck, we didn't talk much about this, but using the answer choices to work backwards or plugging in your own numbers are very good strategies. It can make things that are abstract super easy. You just don't want to work too hard at any point. If you've got like a page full of work on your booklet, that's probably not the right way to solve. You may still get there, but not efficiently. All right, let's talk reading, section 3. And for some people, will be the final section. If you opt out of science, this is it, right? English, math, reading, and you're done. 40 minutes, 4 passages, 9 questions apiece. That's down from 35 minutes. It used to be 35 minutes for 40 questions. But it's still a time crunch. 4 passages and 36 questions in 40 minutes isn't much. So I'd recommend reading the story in maximum of 3 to 4 minutes, assuming we don't have extended time accommodation. Then per question, about 30 seconds per. Some will take longer, some shorter. Annotate, I should have said if you take notes well on the first pass through. So we'll talk about how to do that and what to do, but you really want on ACT reading more than any other section, you want to have your pencil moving and marking up the booklet big time. It's not really annotating because that means analyzing and really putting thought in. It's more hunting for clues and flagging like ideas you think will come up again. You're trying to give yourself a roadmap and an outline so that when you get to the questions, you're not spending as much time going back and forth. It's very easy to read question 2 and then say, all right, A, all right, let me go back. B, let me go back and look. C, let me find it. But we want to be able to eliminate some of these just by looking at our notes and not spending too much time. Here's a few reading questions you can expect. So what's the structure of the passage? And then you'll have 4 choices that are all kind of a lot of similarities. What is the point of view from which the passage is told? So asking about the narrator, who probably won't be indifferent or confused or extreme, for example. So those would not be great answers usually. Main idea of the passage or paragraph, very common. And then key detail stuff, like as used in line 7, the word blank most nearly means what? So that would be vocab and context. So first, some tricks for the reading part of reading. Active reading is essential. And active reading is, again, pencil in hand, circling, starring, underlining, taking notes, especially the notes part. I don't really care as a tutor like what my students circles or stars or underline. That's mostly to stay alert. But gotta have the pencil in hand because that's active. Passive reading is more like starts here, gets to this, and then all of a sudden we're that and we're in trouble. And this is already, section 3, so we've been there for a while. It can be tiring, mentally and actually. The first passage will generally be literary narrative, so like fiction. Don't have to do that much note taking there because it's about the vibe, the characters, the relationships, the feelings. But for informational passages, which would be like natural or social sciences, really want to mark it up and just hunt for clues. Don't get lost in the science, but just say, oh, here's where the intro was. There's the experiment. Here's their methods, the results. takeaways, right? And then you have a little bit of an outline. If you feel like you don't like the fiction-y passages, you don't have to go in order. Maybe start with science and work backwards. Same with questions. Skip questions to preserve time, confidence, momentum. That's huge on this test, right? You don't want to run into a wall and just kind of say, oh gosh, I've got 2 questions in a row, I don't know, I'm screwed. That's not the case, right? Just move to a place where you feel better and can get some momentum. And as I mentioned, the goal of reading the passage is to tag or just make a little note where you saw ideas, not to remember or take note of everything. That's impossible. It's to help your working memory not keep as much in your brain. And I would say of anything you take away from this presentation, this might be the most important, the way to attack the reading stuff as like a hunt for clues. All right, and that's the reading portion, but also there's an aspect for the questions and answers, especially. Because if you think like a test writer, basement dwellers who write test questions all day, every day, they're very predictable. What they do is they write a question and a correct answer, and then 3 choices to fool us. So the goal is to find these throwaway words, words that make answers wrong. So stuff like never, always, only, all are classics that are bad reading answers. We kind of like vague, and we'll eliminate to get to an answer that makes us say, well, yeah, I can't argue with it. It's not perfect, but I can't argue with that. A peacock answer is an answer that's flashy and does a lot and very specific and sweeping. And the sparrows are less flashy. It's just a small, unassuming answer that doesn't say a whole lot, but that's good on reading. It makes it hard to argue with. So there's definitely an art to dealing with answers, and it's mostly elimination, to be honest. A common reading trap that I find my students making is they they assume versus inferring. Whether you are asked to infer or not, you don't really need to infer much or make logical leaps on this test. Don't bring in outside information ever. Don't assume anything. If you ever are saying to yourself, well, yeah, I could see why this answer is right, or oh, maybe, it's probably wrong. Work with what the passage gives you. Even if it says to infer, it's probably still pretty much given. It'll be a very basic inference that objectively most people could make, not just yourself. And then, as I mentioned, science, optional. Big change, definitely one of the biggest. $4 to opt in, so nice little way for ACT to get even more money. STEM students, so if you know you want to go into engineering or math or something computery or sciencey, you probably want to take, you definitely want to take the science section. It'll be scored as a standalone, so it does not affect your composite out of 36. And because we don't know exactly how colleges will handle it, for now we're recommending taking it just to be on the safe side. So if you're taking the EACT for the first time in September, and you're wondering, should I opt into science or not? Again, if you're totally like a liberal arts humanities person, maybe not. But if you have any inkling that you're applying to schools where that could be important, and we don't know that much yet, you should take it. Right? It's still not that long of a test, so it adds 40 minutes at the end, but it's still half of a morning. It's not a long test at all. Science, though, can be overwhelming, and I would say of the sections, historically, of the 4, it's been the biggest crapshoot, where like sometimes people are tired, but also it's just a matter of the type of passages you run into. And sometimes they're like super complicated, and sometimes they're very straightforward. We get an average of a minute per question, but you have to just move quickly. There are going to be 7 complex passages. Each of those will have 5 to a maximum of 7 questions, probably most closer to 5 or 6. And each one will have graphs and charts. Sometimes only one, but usually multiple. And you can see on the left side here, questions 1 to 6 will relate to a passage that has a table and a figure. And I would say your first move is skip to the questions, right? You may want to skim this, but you still really want to go questions and answers first, because then you can refer back to what figure they're asking about. So how do we make this less overwhelming and demystify the section? They are making it a bit more sciencey. So as far as outside knowledge goes, the science section has some and a bit more than it used to. But still, don't get bogged down by the passages. A lot of the information will still be unnecessary, but they have promised to give more science-y questions, so we'll see what that means. But rule number one is go to the questions and the answers and match those words to the graphs. If they say according to figure 2, you're going straight to figure 2, right? If it says based on table 1, straight to table 1, your answer will be there, right? And it's, again, sometimes elimination, but often just finding a perfect match in the graph. Some traps I see a lot. Number one, people don't go to the graph or table or chart that's recommended. That's a big mistake, right? We're kind of looking and spending too much time and not even in the right spot. If the question says according to the passage or based on the table and the passage or based on the information provided, the writers of this section are telling you some of what you need to answer this question is in the text. So we got to go try and find it, or skip that question because it'll take longer and be harder probably, right? So that's part of the strategy. And then what's tough is unless you have extended time, especially, don't bother to care about the science, just make the match, right? We don't have time to really understand it. It may be something you're familiar with, it may not be. And those could be equally good or bad because sometimes people are then inferring when they shouldn't, right? So don't dig too deep into the science, just match and look at the answers and the figures. I will say there generally will always be a perfect answer, even if it doesn't feel like it. The outside knowledge questions, if you're looking at being like, man, I really just don't remember how moles work or how elements work or something, there may be a couple questions out of the 40 that are just unanswerable without that information, but it's going to be pretty rare, and usually you can get it with logic. With graphs, you're looking for trends, so relationships, direct, inverse, or other. Sometimes you have to expand a pattern and extrapolate given that trend. And it may say like, hey, when a plant was this tall, how much sunlight did it get? That might be off the chart, but if we see a constant rate of change, we can guesstimate or really just predict it, especially using answers as guides. And then the harder questions are scientific method stuff, like why did the scientists do this? What was the independent variable? Which was the control? How did these experiments differ? And that's where you'd have to look at the text and think like a scientist a bit more. Here's just an example. We'll just look at a few of them, and then we'll wrap up with some questions. This would be kind of a classic. Based on the results shown in table 2, so we know we're going to table 2. There's only one here, but that being said, there will usually be 3 or 4. A sequoia that produced sap for a period of 370 years. So I don't see that in the table, but I do see sap production period. And so that would be like right there. And the question is, well, what would the sap production be at 370? Well, this also has a direct relationship, or I'd say increasing as we move on. And so it's looking like here is going to be just something bigger than 3640, which is an answer choice. As long as we're looking at the right parts of this column of the table, the right column or columns, this is an easy question, right? We're just expanding that pattern. If they said 345 for sap production period, 345 years, then our answer would have been C. But they didn't, so we'll pick D here because it's just greater, it's expanding more. Another graph question. At which of the following surface temperatures would the luminosity of a star in galaxy B be closest to 2 times the luminosity of a star in galaxy B with a surface temperature of 3000? Well, it didn't point me to a figure, but I'm looking at this provided one, and it's talking about surface temperature, and I see the galaxies. So it has to be this. The y-axis is RL, and if you weren't certain that that was relative luminosity, you would go to the passage where they would define it and tell you that's the term. And then we just look, right? So like luminosity of a star in galaxy B with a surface temperature of 3000 would be right here at 1. When would it be twice that in that same galaxy? Well, we draw straight out from 2 using your pencil in the booklet. Looks like about 3300, right? Making sure I'm looking at the correct line, double check, but yeah, G would be our answer there. And then one more, this is probably the easiest of the bunch. The data best support which of the following hypotheses: as surface temperature increases, the average size does what? Well, here X is surface temperature, Y is average size. It is constantly increasing, not at a constant rate, but it never plateaus or goes down. So it's B, easy. This is just saying what's the relationship between size and surface temperature, and it is a direct relationship. So final tips and tricks: glance at the graphs, maybe skim to process what happens on each passage, but don't try to understand everything. It's a futile effort. Actively read, so pencil in hand, the question, underline, circle what you're solving for, answer choices as well. Then match to the graphs, the figures, the tables. If there isn't a match, we need context from the passage. And then if you're like, man, I still see nothing, and a minute has passed, you have to move on. So if you have time, use common sense, think like a scientist, try to recall something from, I don't know, could be like heterozygous, homozygous, or something you haven't thought about in forever, but it may still be there somewhere in your brain. Use common sense, think what they were trying to get you to pick something and move on. Don't have that much time to linger on these questions. Something to keep in mind is for the September and December ACTs, you can get the full test and questions and answers back. Great resource, whether you're preparing on your own or especially with a tutor, because then you can see, hey, this actual official ACT I took, here are the questions, here's what I missed, let's work through them and learn for next time. So it used to be called the TIR, now it's just My Answer Key. You can order it just on the ACT website. This would be like where you register for the ACT. You can scroll down the recommended programs list, click on View Product Catalog, and again, you get the copy of the booklet, the answers, your answer key, and the scoring tables. It takes a few weeks, so it's not instant, but super important and helpful resource. And again, it's just September, December, and February. Common questions, just to cut those off for the Q&A. When should I begin preparing? There's no right answer, but towards the end of junior year, unless you're a super high scorer, you could like do summer after sophomore year for PSAT and stuff. But usually towards the end of your junior year, I think that's about as late as I would go. And then what's a good score is an impossible question to answer. It depends on where you start, what your goals are, and where you want to end up, and what the schools that you are applying to are looking for. And then super scoring, which means like a lot of colleges look at only your highest section scores from across multiple test sittings, multiple test dates. That's something where I would actually read the recent article by Jed, who's actually the founder of Appleruth. He just put one out today in the Slice newsletter about that mentions how the super scoring works and talks a lot about just the changes to the EACT. So more logistically about like applying and which test scores to send and so on. The general rule is look at the college's admissions policy. And if you have an option to only send your best scores, do that. Send stuff that adds to your portfolio, makes you look good. Don't send what doesn't. We should take the test 2 or 3 times. Really, it takes most students, a vast majority, 3 tests to reach full potential. You can do all 3 junior year or 2 junior year, 1 over the summer or 1 senior year. No wrong time to test, right? And if you think, oh gosh, I'm too late, you're not, right? You can always delay a little bit. And just my final note is like, this is not a test of intelligence. This is a test of effort, but it doesn't measure you as a person. It's one of those things where a lot of schools are still test optional. It's just a test of running into the right thing on the right day and how well you do. You can, of course, set yourself up for success by preparing, but don't let test scores define you because they don't. I'm going to launch one more little poll. And then we're going to open it up for questions. If you're interested in like ACT, PSAT, SAT tutoring, or also do executive function coaching, you can reach out to info@appleruth.com by email or call this number. Again, my name's Tal. You can request to work with me directly. My schedule is pretty full, but like if it was towards the end of the year or next year, you could probably do it. We also have a lot of amazing tutors, just both in person and various locations like Atlanta, and also online. I do all my stuff from Colorado online. So yeah, let's see if you have any questions. If you don't, hopefully you got a lot out of this and can definitely call it a night. Thank you for joining. But I'm going to leave it open for questions for a bit, and I will answer as best I can. So the first question is, will opting out of the science section give you fewer points? How does that work? Kind of covered that, but opting out just means you don't have that science score. So, I mean, the ACT is now out of 3 sections. They average English, math, and reading. So if you don't take science, it's just like, okay, I don't have that score. It doesn't matter if you're not really applying to STEM places or if you're interested in that, but it definitely won't give you fewer points if you opt out. It's not a thing that affects your overall composite score. So I think that's the big takeaway. Next is, can we get access to the live recording or the presentation recording? I believe Alpha sends them out on Fridays. So if you registered for this presentation, you should get this recording on Friday. So thank you. You're very welcome. Keep it open for a little while longer. Next question is, are there any books that I recommend to prep for ACT? I am obviously a little biased, but Alpha has a brand new enhanced ACT book that just came out like a week ago. I think right now it's only digital, but we'll have hard copies soon. That's the best thing. Even without tutoring, you can buy it a la carte, and it's got it's got illustrations. It's broken everything down nicely into the sections. It's got practice tests in the back. That's the gold standard. The other thing would be there's a big red book of 4 new ACTs that are just in the new format. I think that's just called like, what is it? The official ACT prep guide or something. So I think that'd be a good one. And that also answers this next question about practice tests. There's really only 4 out there except for the Alparuth one. We have a new one that's the new EACT mock test. So that's a good option. We'll probably have a second one pretty soon. But for now, there's really not a whole lot out there. On the ACT website, there's one free practice test in the new format. And that book that I mentioned has 4. Yeah, good questions. Oh, no apologies needed. This is a good question. The question is, did I say the EACTs are all still on paper or is there also digital? There is also digital. However, if you have an option, I would still do the paper test because the ACT digital format has always been funky. SAT Blue Book has it figured out. The ACT, I just do not trust their electronic version yet. They've been trying to roll it out for like 6 years. So if you have an option, take it on paper. The only digital ones would probably be like in school, certain schools that offer like in-school test dates might be digital, but it's pretty rare right now. So for the most part, paper, and that would be my recommendation to take the paper one. Yeah, it's nice to be able to write in the booklet and really mark stuff up. Yeah, good questions so far. Question here. Oh, this is a good one. So I know it depends on college, but there's there a test that's higher regarded, more highly regarded, or better looking. So like if you are even on SAT, ACT, if you take a practice test at each and you're like, gee, I like them the same and I'm pretty even. The answer is no. No college prefers the SAT over the ACT or vice versa. So tutor to your strength, right? If you take a couple of practice tests, ACT, SAT, and you know one was just more comfortable or a better score, just prep for that. And if they're even, it's a tough call. I think maybe I stick with SAT until the ACT is a bit more established in this new format. So yeah, That's what I would say about that is there's no preference of SAT versus ACT. It's whatever score or whatever test you feel better with. And then a couple other questions about digital. So SAT, yes, is completely digital. It's all computer based. There's a bunch of SAT practice online via the Blue Book app. And so like when I'm tutoring SAT, we're just sharing screens using the book, but also doing digital practice together. Versus ACT, the question here is where do we see the option of digital versus paper? If you don't see an option, just assume it's paper, but it would be when you register for the official ACT. And I would say anything you're registering for on the website will be paper, I'm pretty sure. Like it would be pretty clear and they'd make it clear if it was digital. So you'd have to really be deliberate to get a digital test. It's not like you're going to fall into a computer-based test by accident. Oh, well, so this person says the only option we saw was computer testing. Well, then that makes that easier the other way. So like that is interesting. I'm not totally sure about that, but if you only have computer testing, that's the only option. Maybe I'd look at later dates. It might have been an availability issue, or it might just be there's certain areas, right? There's certain regions and schools that are doing that. So I try for a paper test. Computer one's not bad. It's just the fact that like the digital format for ACT is just not perfect, but they have improved it quite a bit. So yeah, if you have to take computer, it's not the worst thing, but that's the first I've heard of that you only had that option of computer. Two more questions and we'll probably wrap up. Average ACT score, at least for the old ACT, so 50th percentile nationally was around probably a 21 or 22 out of 36. That means if you scored in the high 20s, that you were well above average. And then if you're in the 30s, you're like 90 something percentile. But average would be probably 22 or so. And then most people won't be happy unless they get to high 20s, depending on where you start and where you're aiming for. And the last question, thank you guys for all the good questions and for joining tonight. Last one is, what ACT score correlates to a 4.0 GPA, or is that not how it works? It's not how it works. The ACT and SAT are like part of your college application and admissions portfolio. So grades are a big one, extracurricular, essay, recommendations, personal statement. But the biggest piece aside from grades, even still these days, is the test score. So what an ACT score can do is if you score really high, that can make up for a less than 4 GPA, right? Or if you have great grades, but your ACT scores aren't amazing, then your grades are kind of carrying more of the weight. It's not a test of intelligence. So there's a lot of students who have great grades, but can't get that test score up. That's probably our most common paradigm that we see in tutoring. So yeah, they don't correlate. And we take tests, standardized tests, to try to either bolster our already great GPA or make up for maybe grades that aren't amazing. And then I did have one more come in, which is, do scores get automatically sent to colleges? Only if you choose that, but the answer is no. And there are very few colleges and universities, like a half dozen, that require you to send all scores from all sittings. And many colleges super score, but that's based on your choice of what you want to send. So that is why it's so good to take the test multiple times. You don't want to be one and done. You want to take the test several times and then choose which scores to send, because that's almost always how it works. All right, awesome questions. Thank you guys for joining. Hope it was helpful and have a wonderful rest of your evening.